Considering the events that followed Babel, God divorcing the other nations, immediately calling Abram to establish his covenant with him and his offspring, and then instructing them over and over to worship no other gods, how was it then possible first century Jews could embrace Jesus as Messiah and not reject their own Bible, let alone embrace the idea of a three-person Godhead? The Trinity is one of the most complex doctrines of Christianity, and one in which many believers are left with very few answers as to its origins, and few who can explain the concept with clarity. Where did the idea of the Trinity originate? Is it possible that this idea was actually born out of the Old Testament? Most people are not aware that ancient Judaism taught the idea of a Godhead, though it was restricted to a two-person Godhead. In fact, in ancient Judaism, a two Yahweh figure was actually referred to as the two powers in heaven idea, and its evidence is scattered throughout the pages of the Old Testament. If the teachings of a two Yahweh figure were so prominent in ancient Judaism, then what happened to it, and why is it not talked about today? During this session, Dr. Heiser will marshal an impressive array of Old Testament scripture verses that provide insight into these questions while showing how the New Testament links Jesus to these Old Testament passages and how the Old Testament gets repurposed in the New and is said of Jesus.
Dr. Heiser, how is it possible that a Jew could embrace Jesus as the Messiah and not deny the Shema?
Yeah, not deny their faith. This is a pretty common problem. Jewish friends I've had, I've had these conversations. We tend to think that we associate Judaism with Moses and the law, the Torah. So this is the faith of Moses, but it's actually the faith of Abraham. Going all the way back to right after Babel, when God calls Abraham, makes a covenant with him. I'm going to be your God, and you're not going to have any other gods. So it's really from the very beginning, when God sort of redefines the people of God after Babel. And it has become an issue because if you have sort of that in your head, the Lord our God is one, Deuteronomy 6, for this is the Shema, and knowing that it means we worship no other. Then when you start talking to people about Jesus, and worshiping him and that he's God and there's this Trinity thing, right away it feels to a Jew like, well, you're asking me to either add another God or reject the one I have and trade him in for something else. So it is a big issue. What a lot of Jews, I would say, I think it's fair to say most Jews and really most Christians don't realize that Judaism used to teach the idea of a Godhead. Now, Judaism more or less restricted this to two. There were essentially two Yahweh figures. The Jews referred to this as the two powers in heaven. And this is very ancient. This isn't something that's like medieval. This is before that. There's actually a famous book by a Jewish scholar who was a rabbinics expert. His name was Alan Siegel. And the book is titled, The Two Powers in Heaven. And it traces the idea of Jews thinking of God as two, not just as one. And he actually asks specifically in the book, hey, when did this become a heresy? When did this sort of drop out of our faith? Because right away you can sort of tell that when you talk about God in terms of like plurality, now it feels like you're on Christian turf now, like with the Trinity. And so Siegel wanted to know, when did we lose this? What's the history of it? Because we don't teach this anymore now. And he actually discovered that it was right around the time of the advent of the early church that this whole subject matter became taboo within the Jewish community. And I think it's important because if we're familiar with why a Jew would think that, it's actually a gateway to having a conversation with the Jew and affirming for them. If you accept Jesus as Messiah, you're not denying the God of Israel. You're actually worshiping the same deity. Just by way of two examples, as to how rabbis, before Christianity, how they would have been thinking about this. The idea is that there was there was the transcendent Yahweh, the transcendent God, who is ineffable, a spirit, okay, exists in heavens and transcendent and, above everything else, the God of heaven idea. And then there are places in the Old Testament where that same God is described as a man, okay, in human form, and interacts with people. And in some scenes, you have both of them in the same scene. So it's a question of vocabulary and also proximity, if I could say it that way, that you have two Yahweh figures. Exodus 15:3 was one verse that they sort of riffed on, where Yahweh is called a man of war. It seems like an innocuous reference, but it still has, God described as a man. And the big one was Daniel 7. I'll just read a little bit from that. Daniel 7 is very familiar to Christians. It says, Daniel in his vision says, I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. So we know who the Ancient of Days is, that's God. His clothing was white as snow, hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. It's a big crowd. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. And then, while they're having this meeting, we get to verse 13, and here was the kicker. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, a human one. Okay, he came to the Ancient of Days, so they're different figures. Ancient of Days and the Son of Man are different. Was presented before him, and to him, not to the Ancient of Days, but the Ancient of Days gives to him, the human one, the Son of Man, dominion, glory, and a kingdom. And his kingdom is an everlasting dominion. Wow. So the rabbis had a lot to say about this passage, because the Son of Man, this human one, coming on the clouds, has things said about him that we really only say about God. And so this passage was central to what Jews used to call the two powers in heaven. And it has very deep Old Testament roots, not just Daniel 7, but there are a lot of passages that have God as man in the Old Testament.
Does the two powers in heaven idea have something to do with the angel of the Lord? Because I've heard that some people think that it was Jesus in the Old Testament.
Yeah, it does. I would unpack the subject a little bit differently. Angel of the Lord is one sort of thread or one illustration of this idea, but there are others. Let's go to a couple passages here. Exodus 3, again, the burning bush story. This is something, passage that pretty much, everyone who's sort of tried to read the Old Testament, you get through Genesis and you hit Exodus, and this is going to be familiar. If for that reason, maybe Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments or something, you're going to be familiar with this a little bit. But if you only have the movie version, you might miss some things. So, burning bush. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. So who's in the bush? Well, in verse 2, it's the angel of the Lord. And you keep reading, and Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. So who's in the bush? Is it the angel of the Lord? Is it God? And the answer is, yeah. I mean, they both are in the bush. And why that's important is that the angel of the Lord in other passages is clearly depicted anthropomorphically, depicted as a man. So you've got two in the same scene there. And this is really important when you get to Exodus 23. This passage is a lot less familiar. If we think of the angel of the Lord here, leading up to this whole, Jesus question, there's a lot of things that go together here. Behold, God tells Moses, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way, to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, which is an interesting line. You remember the Jesus debate with the Pharisees, who can forgive sins but God only? Well, here God says the angel of the Lord is not going to pardon your transgressions. Why? For my name, God says, my name is in him. This is actually an important line. Now, if you have a Jewish friend, the name of God is sort of a big deal. A really observant Jew would not say the divine name. He would not say Yahweh or something like that. There are a couple of circumlocutions, a couple of different ways of referring to God without using, the 4 consonants. And one of those is to say Hashem. You can either say Adonai, the Lord, or Hashem, which means the name. So the name is God. And we get that thinking in the Old Testament as well, where the name is another way to refer to God himself. A couple of examples in Psalm 20, verse 1. Let's just take a look at Psalm 20 in verse 1 and in verse 7, actually. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. What it's not saying is that, well, I'm going to wear a t-shirt with 4 consonants on it and I hope that protects me. No. May the name of the Lord protect you is another way of saying may God himself protect you, in the day of trouble. Verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Again, their trust isn't in a set of consonants. Their trust is in God himself. The name of the Lord is a way, to refer to God himself. And if we go to Isaiah has an interesting passage here. And this is something, what we're talking about here is something called, in scholarship, the name theology of the Old Testament. So Isaiah 30, verse 27. Behold, the name of the Lord comes from afar, burning with his anger and in thick rising smoke. His lips, the name has lips. His lips are full of fury and his tongue like a devouring fire. His breath is like an overflowing stream that reaches up to the neck. You have the name cast as a person. And back in that Exodus passage, God tells Moses, look, I'm going to send an angel with you, and you better listen to him. He will not pardon your transgressions because my name is in him. It's another way of saying, God telling Moses, I am in this angel, this particular angel. And so this is, again, part of this idea that we have God as man and God in human form in the Old Testament. It doesn't mean that God doesn't exist everywhere. God's not, like he hasn't left heaven and come here so that heaven is empty now. It means both. There's a God there, just like in the burning bush. God can be there and the angel can be there. Same time. And you have different episodes like this in the Old Testament where you have a two-ness to God. And the angel, again, is a big part of that whole set of ideas.
So are there any other scriptures in the Old Testament similar to Exodus 23 that refers to the angel as God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are. One of the ways I like to illustrate this is if you do a search or in the course of your Bible study, if you encounter where God delivers Israel out of Egypt. Okay, delivers them out of Egypt, the Exodus, takes them to the Promised Land. If you ask the question, and it sounds really simple, like why would we even ask, but who delivers Israel from Egypt and brings them to the land? Because reflexively we say, wow, God. But the answer is actually different. If you go to, I have a few listed here. If you go to Judges 2:1, really the first 3 verses, this is, again, it's the book of Judges, so they're already in the land, and the angel of the Lord shows up in Judges 2:1 and says in first person language, I brought you up from Egypt. Okay, to bring you to this land. And basically he says, you failed and I'm out of here. You're on your own now. So it's not a good scene, but you have the angel of the Lord, again, using this first person language about, I brought you up out of Egypt to bring you to this land. So, well, maybe the answer is the angel. If you go to Deuteronomy 4:37, there you have Israel being delivered, brought out of Egypt by, God says, my presence will bring you out. What does that mean? Other places it'll be, God, it'll be Elohim or Yahweh. So it's actually a pretty profound question. Who brought Israel up out of Egypt and to the promised land? Because you've got options. You've got Elohim, God. You've got the divine name, Yahweh. The Lord did that. You've got the angel, and then you've got this my presence. And so what's the answer? The answer is all of them. Okay, because they're all pointing to God. The presence really is, I would say, has reference to the Holy Spirit. The angel is clearly God as a man. You know, the other two terms are God himself, but it's God any way you look at it. But what's important is you connect, again, the angel into this sort of matrix of ideas. God as man. And again, going back to the burning bush and some of these other episodes, sometimes they're both present. God and the angel are both present. Another passage that I think is really interesting is Genesis 31. This is where Jacob is having trouble with Laban, that whole story. And the angel of God shows up. Verse 11. This is Genesis 31:11. Then the angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. In other words, I'm going to fix this problem. I'm going to give you, your herds back, your cattle that Laban has stolen from you. And here's verse 13. The angel of God says to Jacob, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. And that's an important episode in Jacob's life. When he's trying to get away from Esau, he encounters God at Bethel, builds an altar there. And here the angel of God says, I'm the God of Bethel. I mean, it's pretty transparent. My favorite, though, is Genesis 48. Genesis 48, again, this is something that we teach in Sunday school. We teach this scene. This is where Jacob is about to die, and he's going to bless the sons of Joseph, the crossing of the arms, that whole thing. But we get the story, but we don't really look at what he actually says in the blessing. So if we go back up to, let's just start in verse 14. Jacob is referred to as Israel here. Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, the God, and Hebrew is Ha Elohim, the God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day. And then there's a third stanza, and you expect to read the God who did something else, okay? But that isn't what you read. We have the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. Bless the boys. And if you were working with a concordance or an interlinear, you would discover that bless there is grammatically singular. So you can't translate it, may they bless the boys. It's may he. Well, which one? God or the angel? And the answer is, yeah. Again, this passage essentially fuses God and the angel grammatically. I mean, it gets to that granular level in the text. A lot of scholars will say, well, this is just the angel showing up and pretending to be God or speaking for God. You'll notice in Genesis 48, the angel doesn't say anything. This is Jacob's assessment of God's activity in his own life. Okay, Jacob is the one that fuses them. The writer fuses them. Okay, so you can't depend on, oh, this is a messenger that has to pretend that he's the person who sent. No, this is somebody else making the assessment. And it's a really important passage. So we have again this two-ness idea going on in the biblical text. And so all of these passages again form a complex of ideas that ultimately is going to lead to the way we read the New Testament, because the New Testament writers are going to reference these things when they start talking about Jesus.
Do angels show up anywhere else in the Exodus story?
Yeah, they do. Believe it or not in the book of Exodus per se, but in the Exodus story. And it's at Sinai with the giving of the law, which again, I don't remember seeing that on the Ten Commandments or the Prince of Egypt, all these movie adaptations of the episode. It's easy to start with this in the New Testament because there are several passages you've got at least 3 where the New Testament will say something odd like, the law was given by angels. Which, again, if you think back to the story, it's like, well, where did that happen? I'll give you some examples here. Acts 7:53 is one of these. So let's just go there quickly. Like I said, there's at least 3 of them that have this idea in it. This is Stephen's speech. So he says, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. You have another one in Galatians 3. Let's just go there. Galatians 3. I believe it's in verse 19. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, Paul says, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. And it was put in place, the law was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Again, this is just weird language. There's another reference in the book of Hebrews to the same idea, but you have to ask, like, where did they get this? Where did they get this idea? 3 times in the New Testament. They get it from a couple of places. There's, depending on if you use the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, you'll see it in Deuteronomy 33. But in Psalm 68, you have a reference to angels being at Sinai. That often gets looped into this discussion. The psalmist says, O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan, O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode? Sinai, okay? Yes, where the Lord will dwell forever. Here's verse 17. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. So this idea of multitudes of warriors, divine warriors around God. Again, it's the heavenly host. This is the Lord of hosts, heavenly host language. At Sinai, okay? So this is actually where they get the notion, as far as angels being present at Sinai. The interesting thing in here is, Paul in Galatians 3 saying that the law was delivered, by angels, through an intermediary. And then the next verse follows. I didn't read it, but Paul feels the impulse to say, but the Lord is one, but God is one. Which again is just kind of weird. Like, why would he be afraid to bring up the law dispensed by angels and then have to remind his readers that the Lord is one? Well, there's a passage in Deuteronomy 9 and 10 that talks about the law being written with the finger of God. Okay, you get this anthropomorphic language. Now, again, my view of this is that the angel of the Lord was present there as well because of this finger of God language, identifying that with God himself. And that's who hands Moses the law, because that was who appeared in the burning bush. And you have angels present there with him. And Paul's comment is to remind, again, his readers that we're not violating the Shema here, okay? We're not having multiple gods. It's that this angel it's okay for him to give the law because he is God. It's okay. So it's just a weird set of ideas and a sort of a matrix of ideas, but this is, again, part of the New Testament tradition about angels and the law, because, again, you have these 3 verses that just say, yeah, the law was delivered by angels. You better obey that. And it's hard to know where in the world they're getting that unless you sort of look back at the passage and think about angel of the Lord, these appearances at Sinai, with the heavenly host. Well, then you can kind of put these things together and see what they're tracking on.
While we're talking about the law, is that how people were saved in the Old Testament?
No, the law wasn't given so that people could earn their way to heaven by accumulating good works. There's no passage in either testament that really says that if you do enough good works, then you're going to merit reward from God and salvation and things like that. And Paul, in the New Testament, really hammers at this because even though he's the apostle to the Gentiles, he is a Jew. And again, he has lots of pedigree, the Pharisee of the Pharisees and all this. And he's trying to convince people that the law is not the means to salvation. So one of the primary passages for this is Galatians 3. He says, let me ask you this, in verse 2. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Because they're under persecution here. And he says, does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law or by the hearing with faith? Just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. This is something Paul wrote as well about in Romans, that Abraham was, accepted by God, in this relationship prior to there ever being a law. So the law is not the crucial element here. And he keeps going in Galatians 3. All those who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. And so on and so forth. I mean, he spends a lot of time talking about this. The law was really given to Israel to give them a means by which they could learn the character of God. Of course, it was going to lead them ultimately to their own failure because they're not perfect. It's going to lead them to the fact that, our salvation, in the afterlife, our destiny is only by the grace of God. God chose to be in relationship with us. He loves us, Deuteronomy 7 and 8. God loved you because he loved you. Moses tells Israel. And so our destiny is really rooted in the grace of God because we're going to fail. And so the law was essentially there to teach that lesson and point them to something beyond, which of course would be the Messiah. It was also a means by which they could express where their loyalty was. So they learned the character of God. They learned that they need to depend on grace. And they ultimately, again, learn that we're going to obey this law to show not only our God that we love him, that we believe that he is going to give us salvation. We believe that he made a covenant with us and that he loves us. We're going to live accordingly. But it will also show that relationship to the rest of the world. Remember, in the whole Old Testament worldview, it's Israel against the nations, Yahweh against the gods. And so the law was a means by which you expressed whose side you were on. Okay, do we believe in the God of Israel? Are we loyal in our belief to the God of Israel as opposed to some other deity? You show that by the way you live. And so you live under the law in that context. It's to help them be what Exodus describes as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Why? Because ultimately, as God told Abraham when he called him, again after Babel, after divorcing the rest of humanity, God's still interested in the nations because he goes to Abraham and says, okay, I'm going to make you these promises. But one of them is going to be that through you, through your seed, ultimately all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Paul writes in Galatians, the same book we've been reading from, that the seed was Christ. He just says that point blank. And so the law was a means by which, again, to attract the other nations into, this is what life should be like, worshiping the true God. This is what God intended. If you follow the law, this is what's going to make you happy. It's going to make you function better in society. You're not going to do self-destructive things. You're going to treat each other with justice. You're going to treat each other like the fellow imagers you really are. This is how it was supposed to work. But it sort of gets perverted and turned into a system of earning God's favor. And God says, no, that isn't the point. I didn't choose you because, you performed well. I loved you because I loved you. Deuteronomy 7 and 8. God never gives up on the original plan. Even when he abandons humanity at Babel, he picks this couple, Abraham and Sarah, and says, we're going to start over. I'm not giving up on the original plan. And it's going to be through you that I'm going to get everything else back. So the law has its own logic, but part of that is not earning God's favor. That's never what it was intended to do.
Are there other passages in the Old Testament where God appears to people as a man?
Yeah. We've sort of focused on the angel to this point, but there are others that don't specifically reference the angel, but give you the same, feel, that really describe the same thing. And I really like these passages because I find that they're so familiar to people, but when you actually look at them, what's in them is often missed. And it's really some important stuff. So Genesis 15, this is God's covenant with Abram. Now listen to the first verse. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And this is going to sound really profound, but visions are things you see. Okay? We have this impression that the word of the Lord is just like a voice talking in somebody's head in the Bible, and sometimes it is, but other times you get this visual language associated with it. And if you read through the passage, it's like Abraham is taking a walk or being brought outside, and it has this visual feel to it, and that's important. If you go over to 1 Samuel 3, and my actual favorite example of this is the story of the little boy Samuel, which again, we're so used to this. How many times have we taught this or heard it in Sunday school and things like that? But this is Samuel and Eli. Samuel is a boy. He's staying with Eli, the priest, and they're trying to go to bed. And we get this episode where it says, "Then the Lord called Samuel," this is verse 4, "and said, 'Here I am.' And he ran to Eli and said, 'Here I am, for you called me.'" Samuel thinks it's Eli, he hears this voice. But he said, "I did not call, lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again. So the whole thing repeats. And it says in verse 7, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him." Interesting choice of words. And so the Lord called Samuel again the third time. Verse 8, he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am," like again. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. It took 3 times for Eli to figure this out. So he said to Samuel, "Go lie down. If he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came, now look at the vocabulary. The Lord came and stood. Okay, invisible things don't get described as standing, because if they were invisible, how would you know? Okay? This is visual language. The Lord came and stood, calling as at the other times. So it's the same figure. Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." And so then God relays a message to Samuel, and it's bad news for Eli. Okay, and so Samuel's a little bit nervous the next morning, like, do I tell him or not? What went on, but he does. And the chapter ends this way. Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. Why did they know that? Verse 21. The Lord appeared again at Shiloh. Okay, Yahweh appeared again at Shiloh. For the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord, or as the word of the Lord. You could translate it either way. Again, here you have the word of the Lord associated with God's standing. Okay, you get this anthropomorphic language. Jeremiah 1, I think, is the most explicit example of this. So if we go to Jeremiah 1, again, this is really familiar material. This is Jeremiah's call to the ministry, as it were. Verse 4, "The word of the Lord came to me," Jeremiah writes, "saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." And so Jeremiah responds, "Then I said, Ah, Lord God." It's Yahweh Elohim. So the word of the Lord is linked now to Yahweh Elohim. I don't know how to speak. He starts, "I'm only a boy, like, don't send me." And they have a conversation. You get down to verse 9. "Then the Lord," Yahweh is the Hebrew term, "the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth." So we have the Lord God, the word of the Lord. They're all the same entity. And we have the language of embodiment, very explicit here. It's tactile. So these other passages, again, telegraph this notion that in the Old Testament, God appears as a man. And as we saw, Exodus 3, the burning bush, I didn't mention before, but Judges chapter 6, you have the angel and God in the same passage. This is where Judaism got its two-ness thinking, its two powers thinking. Not one good and one evil, but two good powers. They're two Yahweh figures. One is invisible and transcendent. The other one shows up as a man. And this is all preparatory for Jews. This is a Jewish audience. This is all preparatory to how the apostles are going to present Jesus and talk about him as God come as man. I mean, they're ready for the conversation, whether they realize it or not. Their own scriptures have this category. And Judaism, again, until the advent of the early church, used to talk about God in these terms. Why? Because it's in their Bible. It's pretty much that simple.
Dr. Heiser, would you give me some specific examples of Jesus in the New Testament?
Mm-hmm. Sure. You know, where Jesus gets linked back to these Old Testament God as man passages. Let's just start with probably the most familiar instance. You have John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. Okay, Word of the Lord. In the beginning was the Word was, with God, the Word was God, this language. And then in verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So this notion of Jesus as the Word is not based on some sort of lofty philosophical discussion from Philo or, Greek thinkers. No, John knew his Old Testament. He knew the Word of the Lord showed up in human form in the Old Testament. And he relates this about Jesus because now it's even more dramatic. The Word became flesh. It's not just appearing as a man. Okay, human form, even if it's tactile, occasionally like Jeremiah 1. Now we have the incarnation. That's even more significant. So that's an immediate attachment. You go to maybe something more obscure. In the book of Jude, in chapter, there is only one chapter, but in the 5th verse of the chapter, we read this. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. So Jesus is actually linked to the figure who brought them out of Egypt and took them to the land. Okay, it's the angel of the Lord stuff, okay, God himself. And then, of course, who destroyed the people who didn't believe, it's a reference to either the destroying angel, okay, the Passover, the death angel, so to speak. And we find out from that terminology, if we compare the terminology there to some other passages, that was the angel of the Lord. Okay, so we've got a verse in Jude that sort of shows both sides of this, where you have judgment and you have deliverance, depending on, of course, who you are. But it's Jesus. Now, this is a controversial verse, in New Testament scholarship, as you can imagine. But textually speaking, even though you'll have other manuscripts that say something else like God or the Lord or something neutral, this is the one that actually has the best textual argument for it. But it's very transparent. Okay, Jesus is linked back to this angel of the Lord stuff. In John 17, again, this is fairly obscure here, but in John 17, you'd have to be really thinking along with the name theology of the Old Testament. This is Jesus' high priestly prayer, and he's praying for his disciples, and he says certain things in this passage, but here's one of them. O righteous Father, even though the world does not know you, I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I made known to them your name, and will continue to make it known, and the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them. Now, I have made known to them your name. What? Jews didn't know what the name of God was? I mean, they had the Hebrew Bible. You've got, the divine names in there a few thousand times. That can't be what Jesus is referring to. When he's saying, I made known to them your name, he's really saying, I made known to them who you are. Okay? How did he do that? Again, the Father is in me and I'm in the Father, earlier in the Gospel of John. These kind of statements where Jesus identifies himself with God. I will continue to make it known, that the love with which you have loved me may be in them and I in them also. Again, foreshadowing the coming of the Spirit to indwell believers. And there's a lot going on in the high priestly prayer of Jesus that is easy to miss unless you're sort of thinking in these Old Testament terms. But the name theology, revealing the name, okay, in John chapter 10, again, I'm in the Father's in me, and I'm going to be in you, and all this sort of language in the Gospel of John. At one point, the disciples rejoice in the book of Acts that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. Well, okay. They're suffering for Jesus. Again, this language of the Old Testament gets repurposed of Jesus the way it was used of God earlier. So there are these little connection points along with some of the more explicit references to the deity of Christ. But the important thing to see here is that for a Jew, sort of on the other side of the crucifixion and the resurrection, when a Jew was asked to embrace Jesus as the Messiah and also as God, because this is what the apostles are preaching, these were easy passages for the apostles to have a conversation with a Jewish friend and say, look, all of this stuff we're saying about Jesus, you find the beginnings of it in the Torah, in your own Bible. The only difference is do you believe in the incarnation and what happened on the cross? Do you believe this is the Messiah? Because all this other stuff, you're not trading one God in for another one. You're embracing the idea that your Messiah was God come to you as a human being, as a man. And all this stuff in the Old Testament should have prepared you for that. And then you go back to Daniel 7 and say, remember the Son of Man, the one who receives everlasting kingship and dominion, the human one? Well, there you go. Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man a lot, including when he was on trial before Caiaphas.
So why then did the rabbis get so fixated on Daniel 7, 9 through 13 and the Son of Man? And how does this passage fit into all of this?
It wasn't so much the kingship idea, even though that's obviously messianic. Believe it or not, the thing that drew their attention was the description of the Son of Man as coming upon the clouds, or you could also translate that coming with the clouds. You say, well, a big deal. It was a big deal because in the ancient world, that specific description, that epithet, the one who rides the clouds, the one who comes on the clouds, or something like that, that was a well-known deity title for Baal, just across the board in Canaanite religion. Baal was a storm god. He's the one who is up there riding the clouds and bringing rain and watering our crops so that we don't starve. Baal's a wonderful guy, all this sort of stuff. And so this was, again, this was well-worn vocabulary. Now, in the Old Testament, you get that description, some variation of that description, 5 times. You get one I'll just read one, Deuteronomy 33:26. There is none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, through the skies in his majesty. There's a similar description in Psalm 104 about God makes the clouds his chariot. There's one in Psalm 68. There's one in Isaiah 19. The point is that these 4 references take a well-known description of the deity, basically the main rival deity to Israel, Baal, and essentially pilfers it and says, no, it isn't Baal who rides the clouds and controls life and death through giving us rain and all this stuff. It's Yahweh. It's the God of Israel who does this. So the rabbis knew this well. They knew that this title was being attributed to the God of Israel instead of Baal as a kind of a slap in the face. The 5th instance is Daniel 7. And in that case, the title is not given to the God of Israel. It's given to the Son of Man. So the Ancient of Days is clearly God. But now you've got a second person in the same scene described with the God title that the Hebrew Bible attributes only to the God of Israel. So we've got 2 now. And they're both described essentially on equal terms. So this is why Daniel 7 drew so much attention to what was going on. And it's really interesting when Jesus is on trial before Caiaphas. And it's the famous scene where, they bring in false witnesses and they're saying all sorts of blather about Jesus, and it's not working out too well. And Caiaphas gets a little frustrated and he says, don't you hear all this? Defend yourself, so on and so forth. And he says, who are you? Answer us. Are you the Christ? All this whole trial scene. And Jesus looks at him, and we think it's sort of a throwaway answer, like Jesus is trying to be cryptic or clever. He says, essentially, you want an answer, hereafter you will see the Son of Man coming upon the clouds, with great glory. he actually quotes Daniel 7. And what he's really doing is he's saying, you want to know who I am? Like, really? Okay, I'm the Son of Man in Daniel 7. I'm the second Yahweh.
An Eshalak Yeshua Nazaret. Amar lana en ant Meshiach bar Elachachai.
Yahweh ana. Takson barnash yetheu bayamin chayil. Te ba'ananesh.
Shila. Kulkom shamila. Hakashkia lachna al shahadu. Shamin milate. Serat kom.
He knows he's just claimed to be God. And Jesus uses Daniel 7 specifically, to tip Caiaphas over the edge. He knows exactly what he's doing.
Ancient Jews spoke of two powers in heaven, pointing to Old Testament scriptures where Yahweh is described in terms of both transcendent God of heaven and as a man in human form. Daniel 7:13 is the most notable of these examples. Right there in the Old Testament, you have God the Father and God the Son in the same scene. This passage, along with others describing Yahweh as the angel of the Lord, the name, the presence, and the word of the Lord, should have prepared every observant Jew for a Messiah that was fully God and fully man. The significance of Jesus quoting Daniel 7:13 at his trial before the Sanhedrin cannot be overstated. The high priest, Caiaphas, knew the scriptures, and he understood exactly what Jesus was saying. Jesus was proclaiming himself the second Yahweh figure of Daniel's vision, the cloud rider, the second person of the Godhead. Jesus spoke truth to power, knowing what needed to happen for God's plan to be fulfilled, and he knew this statement would seal his fate. These Old Testament scriptures have significant implications for understanding the concept of the Trinity. Knowing what was inside the mind of the Old Testament writers helps us parse the grammar and proximity of these figures, lending clarity to our understanding of a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit Godhead in the New Testament.